When the civil wars started in Rome, it was inevitable they would end with one man at the head, the end of the Republic. But the Roman Empire as we know it wasn't inevitable. Its structure wasn't completely formed. It was possible to dismantle it, to make the Mediterranean Sea a place of various different kingdoms fighting for supremacy. The rise of the Roman Empire as the indestructible juggernaut that would survive centuries is owed to a figure that history has made almost legendary: Augustus, the first emperor. But who was Augustus? The easy answer is that Augustus is Octavian. It is a honorific title given to the heir of Caesar, who, in the end, won the civil wars. But Octavian alone isn't Augustus. Augustus is something more. Augustus is a creature made of three people. The first real startup in history. The first emperor of Rome has three heads, and we will get to know all of them. Starting with the center, Gaius Octavius, better known as Octavian. He was born on the 23rd of September 63 BC. The same year Cicero would crush the Catilinarian conspiracy, and Pompey returned triumphant from the east. Rome was restless, violent, shifting. The Republic, though not yet dead, was showing signs of terminal illness. Class conflict, erosion of norms, and political violence were becoming permanent fixtures. Into this world came Gaius Octavius Turinus, a boy of uncertain health but potent ancestry. His father, Gaius Octavius, was a novus homo, a new man like Marius, who had risen from the plebeian nobility of Velitrae to become a praetor and a governor in Macedonia. But it was through his mother, Attia Balba Caesonia, that young Octavian was connected to real power. Attia was Julius Caesar's niece. This made Caesar the boy's great-uncle, and eventually something more. Octavian's early physical condition is well documented by Suetonius in the life of Augustus. He writes, "He was unusually handsome and exceedingly graceful at all periods of his life, yet he was not strong in body, and throughout his life he suffered from various complaints. He could not easily bear heat or cold." Suetonius details numerous ailments: skin lesions, stiffness of joints, insomnia, chronic fatigue, sensitivity to climate, yet this weakness seems only to have sharpened the boy's mind. The Roman virtus often viewed physical frailty as incompatible with leadership, but Octavian would overturn that prejudice entirely. Here, we should pause. Suetonius wrote over a century after Augustus' death, under the reign of Hadrian. His lives of the Caesars are gossipy, moralizing, and often shaped by posthumous imperial ideology. So, while we can take his list of ailments seriously, as they are consistent with Roman medical knowledge, his characterization must be read as shaped by retrospective awe. Augustus, the sickly boy who became master of the world, was a tidy narrative arc for later writers. But let's go on. According to Nicholas of Damascus, a friend and biographer of Augustus, Octavian showed leadership even as a boy, organizing groups of children into mock armies and games of trials and judgments. He was sent to study in Apollonia, in Illyria, this around 45 BC, alongside other young Roman nobles. Among his companions was Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, a fellow student and rising star from a modest background. While in Apollonia, Octavian had access to Caesar's veterans and military commanders. According to Appian, the young man was likely already being groomed for higher roles. He was given direct insight into military logistics and trained in political power, despite being only 17. But then the world shattered. On March 15, 44 BC, Julius Caesar was assassinated in the Senate. The news reached Octavian outside Dyrrhachium, the same place where the Battle of the Walls was fought between Caesar and Pompey. With his great-uncle dead, Rome plunged into uncertainty. But Octavian's response was immediate and astonishing. Rather than staying safe in the east, he set sail for Italy. According to Appian in Civil Wars and Plutarch in the Life of Caesar, Caesar's will named Octavian, not Antony, not any other senator, as principal heir. He was to inherit Caesar's name, legacy, and most shockingly, his vast fortune of 75 million sesterces, alongside gifts to the people of Rome. This will was public, legally binding, but the implications were seismic. Octavian was now Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, the filius adoptivus, adoptive son, of the most powerful man Rome had ever seen. But with that came danger. The Senate feared Caesar's cult of personality. The assassins, Brutus, Cassius, Decimus, had fled, but their sympathizers remained. Worse, Mark Antony, Caesar's surviving co-consul and right-hand man, had in his hands the entire Caesarian party. It's important to recognize that only a handful of sources mention the exact context of Caesar's will, and all of them are post facto. We do not possess the document itself. Much of what we know comes through Appian and Suetonius, both writing with hindsight, under emperors who wanted to portray Octavian's succession as divinely ordained and politically valid. Yet, the speed and conviction with which Octavian acted strongly suggests that the will was real and legally persuasive. The Senate may have resisted him at first, but there was a value in names. Caesar was already a god for a lot of people in Rome and would become a god in 2 years after his assassination. And Octavian would become the son of a god. But before he was divinized, he was already the son of Caesar. Now, already during his return from Illyria, Octavian was consulting with Marcus Agrippa, whose military aptitude and unwavering loyalty would become fundamental to everything that followed. Agrippa had no political pedigree, but he had a talent for strategy and an absolute willingness to serve. The first half of the startup. As Velleius Paterculus put it in his Roman history, Agrippa was obedient to no one but Octavian. With him, an idea was implemented as soon as it was thought of. Also, hovering in the early background was another guy, Gaius Mecenates. After all, as in Game of Thrones, the dragon has 3 heads. Mecenates was an Etruscan aristocrat, a young one, known for his deep connections in Rome cultural elite. While not yet Octavian full propagandist, Mecenates was already part of the circle forming around the young heir, the other half of the startup. Not courtiers, but a team, designed for war, power, and legitimacy. This modern political machine, a term used by modern historian Ronald Sim, is one of the most remarkable features of Octavian's rise. Unlike Caesar or Pompey, Octavian did not rely on personal charisma or battlefield brilliance. He relied on structure. And think about it, Rome always relied on structure. Rome did it from the times of the early Republic. Augustus, Octavian, was Rome in a certain sense. When he arrived in Rome, Octavian was unarmed, untested, and, in the eyes of Antony and the Senate, unimportant. He had no official title, he had no military experience, he had only the name. But as he quietly began taking meetings, paying off veterans and rallying ambitious allies, well, let's let Cassius Dio say it. Even at that age, he had a shrewdness beyond his years. He observed much and revealed little. It was dangerous to underestimate him. When Octavian arrived in Italy in April of 44 BC, he was 18. The world he stepped into was chaos draped in togas. Julius Caesar was dead, and Rome was in a fever. The Senate, far from welcoming his heir, was divided, terrified and already being manipulated by a man who thought himself the natural successor of Caesar's power, Mark Antony. Octavian came ashore near Brindisium, with a single legion to his name. His great-uncle, assassins, had fled eastward, but in Rome, Antony had taken control of Caesar's papers, Caesar's residence, and Caesar's political capital. Suetonius tells us that Octavian was warned not to return at all, that Antony might kill him, or that he would be manipulated and used by others. He came anyway, and did it with gifts. Octavian began distributing parts of Caesar's promised inheritance to the Roman people from his own purse. Even though Antony controlled the estate, Appian describes the move as a calculated stroke. He collected as much money as he could from his own and his friends, and with it, he paid Caesar's bequest to the people. This action could have destroyed him, but it transformed him in the eyes of Rome. The boy who paid Caesar's debts was more Caesar than Caesar's old general who hoarded the funds. He acted like Caesar. The political genius of the gesture is hard to overstate. Without holding a single office, Octavian had begun to speak not only in Caesar's name, but as Caesar's voice. He understood Caesar's ethos, much more than Mark Antony ever could. But the maneuver did not go unnoticed. Mark Antony, consul and war veteran, initially dismissed the boy as naive, referring to him contemptuously as a child. In Plutarch's Life of Antony, we read that Antony warned others, "This is a boy to be praised and honored, but not to be feared." This would prove to be one of the most catastrophic misjudgments, maybe in human history. Antony had expected to inherit the political structure Caesar had left behind, if not legally, then in practice. He retained the consulship, command of troops, and possession of Caesar's files and documents. By denying Octavian access to these, including the actual will, Antony tried to maintain control of the Caesarian faction. Suetonius even claims that Antony attempted to keep the will suppressed entirely, but once it was made public, and Octavian legally assumed the name Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, the public tide began to shift. To understand how deep Caesar's name was circulating in the veins of Rome, coins bearing the new name of Octavianus began circulating in 43 BC, and even before he held a magistracy, he was using his image to stake a claim to legitimacy. This was because of Caesar. Now, ancient historians see Octavian as a torch of justice, a man who comes back to Rome to burn it and make it anew. Some kind of a proto-god, in a sense. But modern historians see him as a very cold and calculating operator. This reading is reinforced by the strategy Octavian used. He did not seek power through standard Republican channels, nor did he openly challenge Antony. Not yet. Instead, he moved among the veterans distributing money and gradually took over Caesar's client network, one favor at a time. He also began cultivating men of talent, positioning himself as the nucleus of a new kind of faction. In this period, Agrippa reappears as more than a companion. He was helping organize support among Caesar's old legions. Octavian was already surrounding himself with doers rather than talkers. He was building something long-term. And it was a different thing than what came before. There was no respect in Octavian for the structure of the Republic. Why? Because that structure had killed Caesar. That structure had destroyed his life in a sense. He was so probably happy being able to study and grow up normally, knowing that power was waiting for him with Caesar. Now, slowly, the balance of power with Antony was beginning to shift. Antony was increasingly embattled. He had turned much of the Senate against him by bullying, stalling, and overstepping his constitutional bound. Cicero, who had initially dismissed Octavian, now saw an opportunity. In his Philippics, a series of speeches aimed at demolishing Antony's reputation, Cicero began praising Octavian as a savior of the Republic. "You, young man, have acted like an old and wise consul. Antony like a tyrant drunk on power." This was a major gamble. Octavian had no official position, but Cicero helped the Senate give him imperium pro praetore, command authority, in order to counter Antony, who was marching north toward Cisalpine Gaul to confront Decimus Brutus. Decimus was another one of the generals of Caesar, but one who betrayed him. Octavian finally had power, and he played the part flawlessly. He accepted the command with apparent humility, marched north, and joined forces with the senatorial legions. His confrontation with Antony at Mutina in April 43 BC, a bloody battle that cost both consuls their lives, was a turning point. Though the Senate tried to reassert control over the victory, Octavian now commanded a real army, an army that Agrippa was immediately able to wield like a sword. The Senate had a plan of how things were gonna go. After the victory, they were gonna elect one of them as new consul and begin re-establishing the Republic. Cassius Dio writes of what happened next. He did not rage or threaten, but said only this, that he would not allow himself to be mocked. Octavian calmly turned his army south and marched on Rome. The Senate, panicked and leaderless, gave in immediately. Octavian was elected consul at the age of 19, unprecedented in Roman history. He immediately passed laws validating Caesar's adoption and all of his own actions to date. He was now legally Caesar's son, not just by will, and he was about to become much more. But let's stop for a second and focus on our startup. Octavian may have inherited Caesar's name, wealth, and political capital, but his rise was not a solo act, as we said at the beginning of this video. From the very start, he surrounded himself with men of extraordinary ability, with which he formed a two-way street of loyalty. He was loyal to them just as they were loyal to him. They were a package deal, very different from the situation that others had had before. Marcus Agrippa was at the core of the Octavian operation. When the news of Caesar's assassination arrived, Suetonius suggests that it was Agrippa to urge Octavian to act immediately and seize his inheritance. That moment, on foreign soil with the Republic collapsing behind them, marks not just the start of Octavian's political career, but the creation of the team. Agrippa wasn't merely a general, he was a second brain. A logistics master, a strategist who anticipated problems before they arose and solved them without grandstanding. In every campaign, Octavian would later fight against Antony, against Sextus Pompey, and eventually against Cleopatra. Agrippa was not just present, he was at the center of the operation. It is worth emphasizing that Agrippa's rise was extraordinary in Roman terms. He had no senatorial ancestry, and no base for inherited power. Yet Octavian placed him on a level above generals like Lepidus, commanders like Decimus Brutus. This was new. This was modern. This was functional loyalty over family name. And that alone marked the death of the old republic. If Agrippa was the arm, Gaius Mecenas, Mecenate to us Italians, was the soul. He had wealth, style, and a razor-sharp political instinct. Tacitus later describes him as effeminate and luxurious in private, but lethally efficient in politics. And that contrast seems entirely intentional. He never held consulship or military command, yet his influence at court was vast. Mecenas' strength lay in diplomacy, cultural messaging, and urban management. He was Octavian's emissary during the internal negotiations, especially in moments when war threatened to fracture Rome from within. Cassius Dio tells us he was sent as an emissary to Antony more than once, helping navigate the fragile balance that would eventually become the Second Triumvirate. I think I have pronounced Maecenas, Mecenas, Mecenate in 100 different ways, so I will now start using Maecenas. That seems to be the most English pronunciation. Sorry for the confusion, that's the Italian in me coming out. So going back to Cassius Dio, Maecenas, a man of great shrewdness and caution, was entrusted with the gravest matters, and acted as proxy for Caesar when Rome could not tolerate his absence. End quote. More than that, Maecenas began shaping Octavian public image in the late 40s BC. There was a fascinating marketing job being done by Maecenas. While Antony was associated with Dionysus, revelry, and martial glory, Octavian, through Maecenas himself, began aligning with Apollo, order, light, and civic virtue. After all, Octavian didn't need to be a glorious general, a glorious commander. He had one. He had Agrippa. So he could be something more, something higher, something divine. That would later manifest in temples, poetry, and religious reforms, but the roots were already present by the 43-42 BC. The idea was simple. Antony might promise victory, but Octavian promised peace. The former offered charisma, the latter stability. Mecenate skillfully used what we could consider praise to Antony in order to aggrandize Octavian. And here is where the difference between the Republic and the Empire becomes visible. The Republic was a system of aristocratic dominance and chaotic compromise, a king of the hill game training the best of the best to conquer everything. What Octavian was building, through Agrippa's armies and Maecenas' messaging, was a regime, a sustainable framework for rule, designed to outlast the man himself. Yet, from a historiographical standpoint, we must be cautious. While Maecenas is lauded in later imperial histories, we hear little about him from contemporaries like Cicero. That silence may reflect a real absence, or it may indicate the secrecy of his role. The Augustan poets, like Virgil or Horace, all praise him as their patron, and that cultural patronage often eclipses his political importance in modern summaries. But the consistent mentions in Dio and Suetonius suggests that behind closed doors, Maecenas was one of Octavian's most trusted operators. It's just not necessarily as public as one would think when you read history. Agrippa, by contrast, has left behind very little personal trace. No letters survive, no speeches, no memories. His presence is documented almost entirely through third-party narratives. Appian credits him with crucial victories, Suetonius records him receiving triumphs, but as an individual, Agrippa remains quiet, a man defined by action, not rhetoric. There is a certain beauty in that. This triangle, Octavian, Agrippa, and Maecenas, was not just a political alliance, but a functional innovation. Caesar had depended on alliances too, but they were always uneasy and often treacherous. Crassus, Pompey, Curio, and later Antony were rivals as much as allies. Octavian's inner circle, by contrast, was deliberately cultivated for loyalty and function. These men were not chosen for wealth or popularity, they were chosen to win and stay together. But what about the other side? What about the other protagonist of the Caesarian party? The only party in Rome right now, since the opposition had fled, mainly, at least the main characters. Marcus Antonius, better known to history as Mark Antony, was no newcomer to power. We have talked about him plenty during this time we have spent looking at Octavian. Now, let's take a look at Antony himself. He had fought with Caesar in Gaul, ended the civil war, served as master of the horse during Caesar's dictatorship, and stood by him almost to the very end. When Caesar died, Antony was consul, meaning that Caesar trusted him to work with him. This meant to many that he was the true heir of Caesar. Now, Antony was a soldier, he was a general, he really wasn't a politician. And so, at the beginning of his reign in Rome, after Caesar died, well, Antony made mistakes. He allowed the conspirators to go free while ratifying all of Caesar's decrees. This was a shrewd move, one that temporarily stabilized Rome, but it is ironic that after using the hatred of the people for those who hurt Caesar, he underestimated how much the people loved Caesar, because they were furious. This created a political vacuum since Antony was not the representative they really wanted. He let them go. the assassins. That is the vacuum that Octavian was now using. Antony's reaction to Octavian's arrival was dismissive, as we said. Plutarch reports that he refused even to meet the young man at first. When he did, the meeting went poorly. Antony expected deference. Octavian expected access to Caesar's documents and funds. Instead, Antony withheld everything: the will, the treasury, and personal papers. While being a capable commander and a charismatic speaker, even if Cicero would have us think of him as kind of a beast, Antony was governed by instinct much more than calculation. Plutarch portrays him as charismatic and generous, but impulsive and vain. Cassius Dio is less forgiving, often describing him as arrogant and short-tempered. Suetonius, writing under the imperial system, the one erected on the body of Antony, offers a backhanded compliment. He had strength of body and boldness of spirit, but no patience, no forethought. Now, consider this. You can see in all of these descriptions that while having something good to say about Antony, everything Octavian is, Antony is not. Now, we can just believe it, and it forms a beautiful narrative, of course, or we can consider this a part of Maecene's work to create characters, to create a narrative, a beautiful story where two opposites collide. After all, this image of a gifted soldier undone by temperament is a common trope in Roman historiography. But it is important to recognize that Antony in 44 BC had very real assets. He commanded loyalty from many Caesarian veterans, had the legal authority of the consulship. He also knew how to rally a crowd and work the plebs. Now, we only have the history we have, of course. I'm just pointing out that many historians had a reason to color him the way they do. But in the end, even after trying to underline the problems with the historiography, I do believe Antony was more similar to his historical image than not. Why? Because we have a primary source, a beautiful one at that. One written by the hands of the best writer and speaker of the time. Now, don't get me wrong, he hated. But when you write for a public who knows Antony, you have to tell the truth. You embellish it, right? You do not attack someone with just blatant lies, you enrich his darker side. And that is what happens in the Philippics of Cicero. Cicero, great politician and a man who had opposed Caesar, was pardoned and was now living in Rome under the Caesarian party. He was a secondary figure now, but still people remembered who he was, the great lawyer, the great speaker, and he was ready to rise up again now that Octavian was around, because he had an alternative to Antony, who he hated with a passion. And so he rose up, writing the Philippics, a series of speeches where he burns Mark Antony to the ground. 14 speeches, to be precise. The model was structured after the speeches of Demosthenes against Philip of Macedon. Caesar launched in them a relentless rhetorical campaign to cast Antony as the new tyrant, the new Catiline, the new Caesar. Catiline was the guy who tried to take over Rome and was stopped by Cicero himself, so there is a little bit of self-aggrandizement there. Octavian, by contrast, was cast as the boy who would save the Republic. So considering that in the Philippics Cicero accuses Antony of political corruption, opportunism, and even compares him to a prostitute, considering he creates this parallel with Catiline, a notorious traitor, well, we can think that while Cicero must be exaggerating, probably the various negative traits we find in Mark Antony in the other historians must have a base in reality. So coming finally back to our timeline, Octavian just triumphed against Antony at Mutina. He requested the consulship, and when he was denied, or at least the Senate tried to deny him, he forced through with his army. The ghost of Caesar still dominated politics, as the assassins, the conspirators, were still out there, in the east, gathering forces preparing to try and retake the city. They represented the noble conservative side of Rome, while the Caesarian party was now split, with Antony defeated, marching north, and Octavian marching on Rome. And here, destiny comes into the picture. During this time, the Octavian startup was moving on Antony on all sides, especially culturally. They were painting him as a corrupt version of Caesar, as a bad alternative in general. And in 44 BC, Octavian gave the people the Ludi Victoriae Caesaris, a series of beautiful public games in honor of Caesar. During these games, something happened that we can actually verify today. A comet appeared in the sky. Octavian seized the moment, declaring it the Sidus Iulium, the star of Julius Caesar, Caesar's soul ascending to the heavens. We today are able to verify that a comet was visible at the time, strengthening the case that this event was genuine. Antony, meanwhile, was facing setbacks. After being declared a public enemy by the Senate, he retreated across the Alps to join Lepidus, another Caesarian general who controlled several legions in Gaul and Hispania. Their alliance was shaky but essential. Antony needed numbers, and Lepidus, ever a political survivor, needed relevance. This convergence triggered a shift. By autumn 43 BC, Antony and Lepidus controlled a formidable military force in Gaul. Octavian, having taken Rome by force and secured the consulship, knew he couldn't face them alone. The Senate, of course, was pinning him against Antony, but Octavian would flip the script. Instead of fighting, he opened negotiations with Antony and Lepidus to formalize their power. Here begins one of the most cynical episodes in Roman political history. The three men, each stained by civil war and betrayal, met personally near Bononia, out on an island on the Reno River. They finally had a chance to speak, with Antony having to take Octavian seriously now, and they hashed out a deal. The Second Triumvirate. Now, we know the Second Triumvirate as the imitation of the first, the one between Crassus, Pompey, and Caesar, but in truth, the first one was a private deal, something that wasn't publicized and didn't have the name First Triumvirate. Of course, first wouldn't be the name it would have had, but the Triumvirate wasn't really a name used. It became used posthumously as the first after the second was created and named. Now, this alliance was not born of trust. It was a necessity. Rome had no clear ruler, no functioning constitution, and three men who each claimed the right to fix it. It also had external threats, mainly from the conspirators who could return, maybe. This deal sidelined the Senate completely. It was the final strike at the Senate power. While the first triumvirate was created to dominate the Senate, the second was created to sideline it. Now, in order to formalize the Second Triumvirate as the ruling organization of Rome, they needed a law. This law was passed through Comitia Tributa, the popular assembly. The Senate didn't vote on it, the people did. It was the Lex Titia, named after the tribune Publius Titus, who introduced it. The law text survives only in fragments, but enough is preserved by later references to reconstruct its core elements. It established a formal commission of three men, Triumviri Rei Publicae Constituende, three men for the reconstitution of the state. They would hold extraordinary powers for 5 years, renewable, and they were immune to all persecution. Their authority included the right to propose and enforce laws without Senate approval, the right to nominate all magistrates, the right to command armies across the Republic, the right to override any existing law, precedent, or veto new law. This conglomeration of power was more comprehensive than Caesar's own dictator perpetuo. They held more power than Caesar himself. Now, before we move on to the last chapter of this first half of the rise of Augustus, let me explain to you why this lex, this law, was passed. I mean, why people wanted it. Because they did. They weren't forced. People were tired. They were exhausted. Think about it. We are in 43 BC. Sulla occupied Rome militarily around 82-83 BC. So, in 40 years, you had the civil war between Sulla and the Marian party. You had the proscriptions. You had the problems with the pirates, you had Pompey coming back with half of the world's wealth, you had Crassus and his army disappearing in the east in Parthia, you had Pompey against Caesar. You had the conquest of Gaul, you had so much war, so much wealth and devastation, and of course wealth is good, right? But it creates instability. All of this money, all of these riches coming back to Rome in only 40 years completely remade Rome. This is why you see all of these characters springing up all the time because of all this money going around. You see new people, new families, new organizations. Stability has gone to hell. And if there's something people love, it's stability. We want to live our life without too much of a hassle. We want to just be left alone. And now, looking in the eyes of a new civil war, the people said, no thank you. Just rule. Just do it. I don't care about republican institutions. I don't care. Just rule and be at peace. Of course, the Second Triumvirate would not stop a new civil war. We will have our final confrontation, but in the end, the man who got the favor of the people, the man who in the end won, both militarily and in the hearts of the Romans, was Apollo. Stability, not Dionysus, charisma and new adventure. Frankly, by giving a very quick analysis of the Lex Titia, you can immediately see that it has deep gashes in it. There's no review mechanism, no court oversight. There's no way they can balance each other out other than vetoing each other, which is not great for stability. Yet it worked for a while. We can find coins with the triumvirates there representing stability as the saviors of Rome. Temples were refurbished to show this new power to the people. The Ludi Victoriae Caesaris were held again, reinforcing divine sanction. Agrippa, meanwhile, began building projects that subtly rewrote the urban space, new forums, porticos, and altars that recast Rome as the capital of a righteous new age, separating it from the past. Behind this, of course, was violence. This violence expressed itself in two ways, externally and internally. Externally, there was the problem of Brutus and Cassius, the assassins of Caesar. They had gathered the last great Republican army. They controlled the eastern provinces, had the loyalty of provincial governors, and they were raising money and troops at a staggering rate. With them were men of senatorial authority and Republican faith, the final hope for the old system. And they were not just resisting, they were preparing to invade. Many in Rome hoped they would, Cicero among them. He had hoped that the Republican cause could prevail in the Senate and in Italy. But the battle would be fought in the fields of Greece. But the three rulers of Rome knew that unity was required for victory, and unity would be taken with blood. This was the internal front. Before leaving for war, they made one last decisive move. They recreated the proscriptions. The Republic had seen such purges before, most notably under Sulla. But what followed in 43 BC was something different in both scale and psychology. Each triumvir submitted a list of enemies to be killed and their property confiscated. At first, they hesitated to include friends and relatives, but that restraint crumbled quickly. Plutarch reports that Octavian allowed Antony to add Cicero to the list in exchange for sparing Octavian's own allies. They were playing a chess game. The famous anecdote that Octavian wept before signing Cicero's death warrant may be true, but it changes nothing. In total, 300 senators and 2,000 equites were killed or outlawed. Cicero's head and his right hand, the hand used to write the Philippics, were nailed to the speaker's platform. It was the end of Republican oratory. From now on, power spoke with legions, not words. And yet, the bloodletting served a purpose beyond vengeance: money. The Eastern campaign would be ruinously expensive, and the proscriptions founded it. Ancient sources emphasize the scale of confiscated wealth. Cassius Dio notes that many innocents were killed simply to claim their estates. Modern scholars, like Eric Gruen, note that while Sulla's proscriptions may have been political cleansing, these were administrative, targeted, rationalized, and aimed at financing war. It wasn't a frenzy, it was budget. With Italy pacified, the triumvirs turned east. Now, this video is already long enough to go into details about the campaign, so we will jump to the Battle of Philippi in October 42 BC, the final battle of the campaign. Our sources are vivid and contradictory about them. Appian describes Antony as a hero, charging personally into the fray, rallying troops, saving the center, while he describes Octavian hiding in a swamp during the first day of fighting, a charge repeated by both Suetonius and Plutarch. Suetonius says Octavian was ill. Plutarch implies cowardice. Modern historians tend to split the difference. Octavian was unwell, but also likely untested in open combat. Regardless, it was Antony who won Philippi. He destroyed Cassius' position on the first day. Brutus, left alone, held out until the second battle, then committed suicide when the legions broke. The Republic died with him. Antony buried Brutus with honors. Octavian did not attend the funeral. He remained in camp, consolidating control, executing prisoners, and preparing to return to Italy. As usual, a cold, calculating Octavian and an instinctual Antony. And so the table was ready for the great game. The great game between Antony and Octavian, with Lepidus becoming more and more irrelevant, partly by choice because he was a survivor. He just wanted to survive, he didn't want to rule. The Republic was dead, and Rome would be ruled by someone. And that someone would be decided on the battlefield, both of politics and of military action. The result would be the ascension of a new person, the three-headed dragon of Augustus. With the Lex Titia passed on the 27th of November 43 BC, the Roman Republic died. For the first time in its history, there was no way back, no road to resurrection. Caesar had died a year before this, and the beginning of the empire was still years away. And yet, the story of the Republic was over. So if Octavian, heir of Caesar, becomes emperor in 27 BC, and the Republic died in 43 BC, this means that in the history of Rome, there is 17 years of no man's land. No empire, no republic, only two men ruling Rome as autocrats. This is the story of those 17 years. This is the story of Octavian and Antony, the two great opponents of this age. This is the story of the rise of those who would forge the Roman Empire as we know it. And finally, it is the story of three women: the queen, the princess, and the empress. On the 27th of November 43 BC, The Lex Titia was passed to formalize the new state of Rome. Mark Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus had formed a formal alliance, and through that they would rule Rome. The full name of the law was Lex Titia de Triumviris Rei Publicae Constituende, the law concerning the three men for restoring the Republic. The irony was not lost on later historians. Appian remarks that though they called it a restoration, it was the end of the Republic. The phrase Rei Publicae Constituende implied constitutional repair, but the law de facto created a new form of government. The Lex Titia granted the Triumviri the power of consuls, dictators, and censors combined, without the oversight of any existing institution. They could make law without Senate approval, appoint magistrates and governors, try and execute citizens without trial, confiscate property, and override any civic or religious veto. The name of the three triumviri officially appeared on public fasti, the calendars of magistrates, from 43 to 33 BC, replacing consuls in authority. Epigraphic evidence, like the Fasti Antiates Maiores, lists triumviri before consuls. Coins minted during the period bear the names of the triumviri and their title. Cassius Dio is explicit. There was no longer any law or legitimate government except through the will of these three. But why did these three men need to formalize their alliance this much? After all, the previous triumvirates didn't need to do so, they had a private agreement. So let's go through them. Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, 19 years old when Caesar was murdered, had an unshakable claim but little military experience personally, even if he had Agrippa to do the dirty work for him. Military experience was still very important for the people of Rome, and to gain their trust. Mark Antony, on the other hand, had experience both as a politician and a military commander. He was a part of the inner circle of Caesar, but he had no legitimacy. Caesar had clearly indicated Octavian as his direct successor. Then there's Lepidus, Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, often overshadowed by the other two. He was no mere placeholder, though. Born around 89 BC, he was from one of the Republic's oldest patrician families. He had been consul in 46 BC and served as Caesar's master of the horse, the second in command to the dictator. Lepidus was Pontifex Maximus, just like Caesar, the chief priest of Rome, and more importantly, after Caesar's death, he controlled 11 legions in Gaul and Spain. Under the agreement ratified by the Lex Titia, the three men divided the Roman world among themselves. Antony received Gallia Comata, Transalpine Gaul, plus the East, including Asia, Syria, and the client kingdoms such as Judea and Egypt. Octavian was given Italy, Cisalpine Gaul, Illyricum, and the responsibility of settling Caesar's veterans. Lepidus was granted Hispania and Narborensis, southern Gaul. He also had control of Africa. Now, how did the people of Rome take all of this, the triumvirate? Surviving evidence of popular reaction is sparse, but telling. There were no riots, no massive resistance, no flood of senatorial suicide followed the law passage. That silence may be the result of fear or exhaustion after all of that civil war they had witnessed, first between Marius and Sulla, then between Caesar and Pompey, and now between the triumvirates and the killers of Caesar, with the obvious confrontation between Octavian and Antony on the horizon. But the lack of riots doesn't mean that the streets of Rome were spared the blood. The ink of the Lex Titia had barely dried when the triumvirs turned to the question that haunted every Roman regime change: how to pay for it. The answer was not merely cynical, it was structurally embedded in how power now functioned. The Second Triumvirate didn't inherit the Republic, it inherited its debts, and debts had to be paid. And so, within days of the alliance at Bononia, the triumvirs began drawing up proscriptions, a systematic list of men to be declared outlaws, stripped of citizenship, their properties seized, their lives forfeit. Through Appian, we have a most detailed account. He claims 300 senators and 2,000 equestrians were listed. Plutarch says that proscriptions were the result of hard negotiations. Each man submitted names. Cicero, the great republican politician and orator, was among them. Antony wanted him dead. The legal mechanism was simple, similar to the proscriptions of Sulla. Once posted, a man's name became a warrant. His head was worth a reward, and anyone, freedman, slave, family, could be the executioner. The bounty system turned Rome into a marketplace of murder again. Property was auctioned to pay soldiers. Land was seized for colonization. In many cases, entire families were destroyed just to be sure, in order for no one to be able to claim the land back in the future or take revenge. Appian remarks bitterly that even loyalty could not protect a man. Some had not opposed the triumvirs, but were simply rich or had good houses. Through this bloodbath, a series of objectives were achieved by the triumvirs. 18 veteran colonies were built across Italy. Bonuses were given to the legions, and the senatorial class was crippled, their influence on key provinces completely annihilated. Now, as we saw in the previous episode about the rise of Octavian, the alliance quickly destroyed the traitors of Caesar, Brutus and Cassius, at Philippi. Then, things started to stabilize. The three rulers of Rome went to their own areas of influence. Lepidus in Africa, Octavian in Italy, and Antony in the east. Antony moving east was at first a return to old republican custom. Commanders had long sought wealth, allies, and prestige among the client kings and cities in the Hellenistic world. Antony was therefore using old republican strategies to gather power and prepare for the inevitable conflict ahead. He critically aligned himself with Cleopatra VII of Egypt, a ruler he had already met during his time with Caesar in Alexandria, when Cleopatra became very intimate with Caesar. Cassius Dio tells us that Antony summoned Cleopatra to Tarsus in Cilicia in 41 BC. Ostensibly, this meeting was to explain her conduct during the civil war. Her appearance, says Plutarch, was theatrical and calculated. She arrived in the guise of Aphrodite, sailing up the river in a golden barge, attended by boys dressed as cupids and women dressed as nymphs. Antony, who saw himself as the new Dionysus, was enchanted. Now, if you have followed me for a while, you know I am a sucker for sources and understanding them. And we need to remember Plutarch is telling this story. And Plutarch was Gossip Girl. Literally. Plutarch wanted to tell stories of lives that would teach you about morality. He wanted characters larger than life. He wanted storylines larger than life. Now, recently there has been a lot of discussion about Cleopatra. Was she a seductress or was she a genius statesman? I have even seen a lot of discussion about if she was actually beautiful or not. Now, many of these are very mute points because we are looking at statues, and statues don't really capture the essence of a person. What I personally believe is that while, of course, Plutarch is absolutely not to be taken literally, there has to be a seduction component to Cleopatra's ascension to power. But of course, we know Cleopatra wasn't just that. She was playing the field very strategically. So whether you like to imagine the romance between Antony and Cleopatra, or you prefer to think of a geopolitical meeting between the two, the result is the same: an alliance. Cleopatra had resources Antony needed: money, ships, and the prestige of an ancient monarchy. Egypt, as the last great Hellenistic kingdom, could finance his ambitions, and Antony had something he could give that he really wanted to give. He could offer recognition of her son by Caesar, Ptolemy XV Caesarion, a direct challenger to Octavian for the role of heir of Caesar. Antony had a clear fascination with the East, just as many Romans did. Did he want to be a king like the Hellenistic ones? It's difficult to say. Sources that clearly point at that are deeply related to Augustus, to Octavian. And of course, to say someone wants to be king is a terrible attack in Rome, meaning it's a very good way to attack the reputation of someone. At the same time, in Italy, Octavian was working on harder situations. In order to settle Caesar's veterans, he needed more money. And that money came from agrarian confiscation. He seized land from Italian landowners to redistribute to veterans. This created enormous unrest. Now, how do we know this happened? We know through the poet Virgil, a primary source. His family was briefly displaced. In his writings, he has shepherds mourn the loss of their farms to marching soldiers. From this unrest emerged the Perusine War, from 41 to 40 BC. A brief but intense civil conflict sparked by Fulvia, Antony's wife, and Lucius Antonius, his brother. Ostensibly, they fought to defend Antony's share of Italy, but in practice it was a test of Octavian's grip on Rome. Fulvia raised 8 legions and fortified the city of Perusia, modern-day Perugia. Octavian laid siege, starved the defenders, and captured the city by early 40 BC. Appian tells us that Fulvia was exiled. She died of illness or heartbreak, whatever you prefer. Lucius was spared but humiliated. The city's senators were either executed or forced to submit. The event revealed a key truth. Antony's absence was Octavian's opportunity. In the aftermath of this conflict, Antony returned to Italy to confront Octavian, and another war seemed almost inevitable. But both sides were exhausted. In Brindisium, they met and chose peace. Their agreement had 3 parts. Antony retained the east, Octavian the west, with Lepidus being slowly faded out. Lepidus was okay with it. He was a political survivor. He wasn't trying to be the ruler of Rome. He was just trying to survive, which he did. The second point was the veteran settlements. Octavian would complete his land distributions, closing the matter for good. Point 3 was marriage. To seal the deal, it was necessary for Octavian and Antony to have a personal, familiar relation. After all, it was family ties that had allowed the rebels connected to Antony by blood to rise up against Octavian. So, it was decided. Octavia, Octavian's sister, would marry Antony. We had talked about the queen, the princess, and the empress. Now we have seen the queen, Cleopatra, and the princess, Octavia. Octavia was a widow with children. She was admired for her dignity and loyalty. She became the public link between East and West, a living embodiment of the fragile alliance between the two men. Velleius calls her a woman of surpassing virtue. Plutarch writes that she soothed and calmed Antony's fury, like a harmony between 2 tempers. The marriage was heavily promoted in Rome. Coins were minted with Antony and Octavia side by side. Public statues honored Octavia. For a time, the world appeared stabilized. She was the great sister of Octavian and the great wife of Antony, aggrandizing both in one stroke. The problem was that Antony's attention was divided. He got the princess, but he wanted the queen. Despite his formal marriage to Octavia, he returned to Alexandria in 37 BC. There, he resumed his relationship with the queen and began a bold reorganization of the eastern territories. Octavian, meanwhile, finally free of the harder part of reorganizing Italy, was finally able to consolidate power. He placed Agrippa in charge of naval operations and Maesias in charge of Rome's internal security and propaganda. These two, young and capable, we talked about them a lot in the last episode, were his other two heads, executive agents of Octavian's will. Agrippa engineered the construction of Portus Julius, a vast military harbor at Misenum. In there, he modernized the fleet. Maesias maintained order, founded poets like Horace and Virgil, and ensured that the image of young Caesar was tied to peace, stability, and Rome itself. The truth is that Cleopatra's increasing visibility created problems. Her presence at Antony's side, her titles, and the growing political role of Caesarion began to raise alarm. By 36 BC, Antony granted Cleopatra and their children territories in the east, a gesture known as the Donation of Alexandria, which would later become politically catastrophic. But that comes later. For now, the years between 42 and 36 reveal the slow detachment of Antony and Octavian from their original alliance. The Lex Titia had created shared power, but ambition, distance, and personal rivalries had turned that power into a contest. Now, let us stop for a second and focus on the queen. Cleopatra was not just a romantic accessory to Antony's story, as she has been represented a lot. She was a monarch, of course, the last scion of the Ptolemaic dynasty, which had ruled Egypt since the death of Alexander the Great. Her lineage and blood was Macedonian Greek, but she was the first Ptolemy to learn Egyptian, and the first to actively participate in native religious rituals. She knew the power that such an action would have on the population and was loved for it. The Roman sources, from Plutarch to Cassius Dio to Appian, are obsessed with Cleopatra's appearance and charms, but often ambiguous or contradictory. Plutarch admits that her beauty was not in itself so remarkable, but that the charm of her presence was irresistible. Cleopatra presented herself as a divine monarch in coins, inscriptions, and religious festivals. She adopted the persona of Isis Aphrodite, fusing Egyptian and Greek traditions into a single image of sacred femininity. Antony responded in kind, taking on the mantle, as we said, of Dionysus, god of liberation and fertility. Now, was this a good idea? A lot of people talk about Cleopatra like a strategic genius. And, well, of course, Cleopatra lost. So, was she? It's difficult to say. After all, not all people who lose their war, who lose their confrontation, are by definition incapable. They just meet their match. But I do believe we can say that the posturing of Cleopatra was born of a deep inability to understand the Roman character. The goddess Cleopatra could seduce and charm single men, but she was never gonna be sold to Rome, and Rome was the only marketplace around. One can be as powerful as he wants in Egypt, but at this time in Mediterranean history, it is only in Rome that things are decided. If Rome wants you dead, you're going to die. Antony, on his side, had a strategic logic to it. He had hoped to establish a new Eastern political bloc, rooted in Hellenistic monarchy, in which Caesarion, Cleopatra's son by Caesar, would play a central role. In the Donation of Alexandria, Antony distributed eastern territories to Cleopatra and her children. Let's go into details. Caesarion was declared King of Kings and co-ruler of Egypt. King of Kings was, of course, the title the Persian Empire had. Alexander Helios, their son, received Armenia and Media. Cleopatra Selene received Cyrenaica. Finally, Ptolemy Philadelphus was given Syria and Cilicia. So the three children of Cleopatra and Antony, a daughter and two sons, were assigned territories. These announcements were made in public in Alexandria, with Cleopatra seated on a golden throne in divine dress. Antony's gesture was unprecedented. He was allocating Roman provinces to children, some of whom were not even Roman citizens. and elevating Caesarion above his own authority. In modern popular culture, such as the HBO show Rome, Antony is shown as a violent and bumbling idiot, and he is just being taken for a ride by Cleopatra. But by looking at this and at the donation of Alexandria, we should be seeing a man who is trying, with Cleopatra, to begin a new age in the East, to bring back the great dynasties, to create a great dynasty. And there is something tragic in it, or at least I see it. Can you imagine this man who has risen to the ranks through Julius Caesar, a soldier, a commander, a man who fought for Rome, who bled for Rome, and then saw his friend and commander slaughtered by the same great people he was taught to admire? Is it possible that what we're looking at here is the disillusion of a man? Is it possible that Mark Antony was lost? To him, Rome was dead, and he was searching for something new. And he found it, as it often happens, in something old. But none of this truly matters to what happened next. Roman reaction was immediate and hostile. While Antony remained in the east, Octavian took control of the narrative. Antony was portrayed just as we see him today, as a traitor enthralled by an eastern queen, and abandoning Rome for Alexandria. The donation were not merely a constitutional breach, they were a symbolic reorientation of Roman power away from the city and the Senate, toward a new dynastic monarchy abroad. This was anathema to Roman ideology. Rome had long tolerated foreign allies, even monarchs, so long as they remained subordinate. Cleopatra's actions and Antony's complicity were unacceptable. Now, as it is tradition in our channel, it's time to look at the sources. Much of what we know about Cleopatra comes from hostile voices. Plutarch wrote in the 2nd century AD, shaped by moralizing Greek-Roman elite views. Cassius Dio wrote under the Severan dynasty, not exactly a high point in Roman openness of mind. Cleopatra was a femme fatale to them all, manipulative, dangerous, cunning. But Egyptian and Eastern sources, limited though as they are, depict her as a capable ruler, who navigated Rome's civil wars while preserving Egypt's autonomy. Her economic policies stabilized currency, her fleet was strong, her rule lasted over 20 years, longer than most Ptolemies. Moreover, Cleopatra's use of divinity was not unusual in Eastern monarchies. Rulers had long adopted divine personas to stabilize regimes. The shock in Rome was for Antony, a Roman general, that played along with this. Coins from the period reinforced the dual imagery. In 36 BC, Cleopatra issued silver coins with both her image on some and Antony's image on others, creating a dual image of power, parallel from each other. Meanwhile, in Rome, Cleopatra became a living specter of everything Rome feared: a foreign queen, a female ruler, a divine figure, a threat to hierarchy. Octavian's propaganda shaped this image. He called attention to 3 specific things: Antony's will, seized and read aloud in the Senate, which declared his wish to be buried in Alexandria; the presence of Caesarion as Caesar's true heir, undermining Octavian's own claim; and the idea that Antony abandoned Roman values, enthralled by luxury and lust. So in the end, what is our judgment of Cleopatra? Of course, she is not just the seductress she was thought of by Plutarch. She is not just the genius strategic mind that many modern publications portray her as. We have to concede that, considering the many strategic mistakes she made. She is a woman. She is a person. She believed her own hype a lot. She believed she could achieve things that were completely impossible. And she was very capable, very well read. So she had reasons to believe she could do these things. A smart woman with delusions of grandeur, cultivated by the fact that she was seen as a goddess, and worked very hard to maintain that image. It might not be a characterization that satisfies anyone, But satisfying characterizations of people in history are usually what you get from Plutarch, a writer who is trying to teach you something with the lives of people. So you either want the truth, you either want to understand what happened or the people, or you want Plutarch. You want good stories. And Plutarch's stories are very good. So that is your choice when you walk through history. So tensions are rising, and they are in a personal way, not only in a strategic way. Antony returned to the east in 37 BC, and his renewed relationship with the queen meant he was humiliating the princess, Octavia, Octavian's sister. Yet, Octavia did not vanish from public life. On the contrary, she played her part with stoic visibility. When Antony failed to return to Italy, Octavia left Rome in 35 BC and traveled to Athens with her children and gifts for Antony's army. A direct attempt to assist her husband militarily while maintaining moral superiority. Or was it? Maybe Octavian knew that Antony would refuse to see her, just as he did. Appian tells us that Octavian used this insult to devastating effect after all. Octavia returned to Rome not in disgrace, but in quiet triumph. Her dignity became a weapon. She moved back into the house of Antony on the Palatine Hill and raised both her children and his children by Cleopatra, who had been sent to Rome earlier. Silently, from Antony's house, Octavia created an inversion of Cleopatra's glamour, not queenly splendor, but Roman virtue. Now, in Roman politics, women had no formal office, but they weren't without power. Public perception was power. Octavia's visibility in Rome, modestly dressed, charitable, dutiful, it contrasted sharply with the rumors of Cleopatra's lavish court. Statues of Octavia were erected in temples and public places. She appeared at festivals and civic events. Suetonius and Cassius Dio both emphasize her centrality to Octavian's public image. Her household became a political mirror of Augustus' intended Rome. Orderly, loyal, multi-generational, even open to forgiveness, since she was raising Cleopatra's children. It is in this context that poets like Horace and Propertius began to write odes glorifying domestic stability and Roman motherhood. Octavia's restraint also gave her immense moral authority. In the wake of Antony's abandonment, she did not divorce him. Instead, she waited, publicly forgiving, privately humiliated. By refusing to sever ties, she became both a knife perpetually stabbing at Antony's betrayal and kept control over Antony's Roman affairs because she was still the wife. Even after Antony's final break with Octavian, Octavia raised 3 sets of children. Her own by Marcus Claudius Marcellus, her first husband, her own with Antony, and Cleopatra's. Octavia became the prototype of the imperial woman. Later empresses, Livia, Antonia Minor, Agrippina, would follow her mold, and when she died in 11 BC, she was deeply honored by Augustus. Cassius Dio tells us she received a public funeral and was buried in the mausoleum of Augustus. The Senate granted her divine honors, though not full deification. A rare recognition for a woman in that era. That is still far in the future in our story, so let us go back, for it is time for our third woman to enter stage. After the queen and the princess comes the empress. In 38 BC, as Antony drifted ever closer to Cleopatra and war loomed on the horizon, Octavian made a choice that would alter the very fabric of Roman future. He divorced his previous wife, Scribonia, on the day she gave birth to his only child, Julia, and married Livia Drusilla, a woman already pregnant with another man's child. It was a scandal, and it was a statement. Livia was from the Claudian gens, an old patrician family with deep republican roots. Her father, Marcus Livius Drusus Claudianus, had been a supporter of Brutus and Cassius. Her first husband, Tiberius Claudius Nero, had even fought against Octavian during the civil wars and fled with both her and their son in exile after the proscriptions. So, while of course there are personal factors to consider, Octavian's decision to take her as wife was a bold act of reconciliation and power politics, an attempt to merge his Julian popularity with Claudian pedigree, to reconcile Rome with itself. Cassius Dio notes that Octavian first saw Livia in 39 BC and was struck by her beauty and noble bearing. The sources emphasize that Livia was pregnant by Tiberius Nero at the time of their marriage, and Octavian just waited for her to give birth barely before taking her as his own. Some saw this as improper, others as a symbolic appropriation of the future. Tiberius, the child born from another man's seed, was entering the most powerful family in Rome. There was reconciliation in this concept too. The marriage had no children, whether for medical reasons or by design. The fact is that Livia remained childless by Octavian, a fact that reinforced her image as a dignified Roman matron rather than a rival dynast. Yet, her importance cannot be overstated. From the moment of her marriage, Livia became the female counterpart to Augustus' vision of Rome. Modest, loyal, silent, fertile in the ideological sense, not the biological. If Octavia was the antithesis to Cleopatra as a woman, Livia was the antithesis of Cleopatra as an empress, as a queen. Public imagery began to mirror this dichotomy. On coins, Octavian appeared flanked by symbols of peace, fertility, and tradition, cornucopias, altars, and domestic animals. Livia did not yet appear directly on coinage, this would come only later, but her public functions grew. She sponsored religious festivals, supervised moral legislation, and gained authority over the women of Rome. Suetonius and Tacitus describe her as a political partner in all but name. She received foreign envoys, advised Octavian privately, and cultivated an influence that was subtle but vast. Her ability to orchestrate marriages that knit Rome's elite into a new imperial order was an important part of the rising Octavian regime. Now, in the last episode especially, we have talked about Augustus as this three-headed dragon, a startup made of many people, not only Octavian. Livia is part of Augustus as well, and her domain, other than what we have talked about this far, was succession, the future. Her son, Drusus, was married to Antonia Minor, Octavia's daughter. He would father Germanicus, who would be fairly important in the future of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Her other son, Tiberius, married Julia, Augustus' daughter by Scribonia. In this way, Livia's descendants merged with those of both Octavian and Antony, making her the grandmother of emperors and great-grandmother of Nero himself. Yet, ancient sources wrestle with Livia's power. Pliny praised her domestic virtues, but Tacitus repeatedly hints at darker undercurrents. He accused Livia of plotting against Octavian's natural heirs to clear a path for her son Tiberius. While no hard evidence supports this, the repetition of the suspicion has a value of its own. It is across many sources and reveals a deep Roman discomfort with the power Livia had accumulated, and maybe a hint of truth. Augustus, however, seems never to have doubted her. He honored her publicly, included her in state cults, and granted her legal privileges unheard for women. And so as time passed and Octavian and Antony kept growing apart, the turning point came. The decisive break came with Antony's Parthian campaign, an attempt to outshine both Caesar's legacy — Caesar, after all, was preparing this specific campaign when he was killed — and Octavian growing auctoritas. His eastern strategy, however, was rooted in an error of both logistics and legitimacy. After a formal renewal of the Triumvirate in 37 BC, at the Treaty of Tarentum, brokered with Octavia still visibly serving as mediator, Antony returned east with promises of military aid from Octavian, but Octavian delivered little. Plutarch claims that Octavian sent only a token force and delayed on purpose, knowing Antony would be forced to rely more heavily on Cleopatra's aid. The Parthian campaign, launched in 36 BC, was aiming to avenge the catastrophic Roman defeat at Carrhae in 53 BC, where Crassus had died and 7 Roman eagles had been taken, the eagle standards from a legion. But Antony's campaign quickly descended into disaster. He brought an army of over 100,000 men, including Roman legions and allied auxiliaries, into Armenia, and then deeper into Parthian territory. But the Parthians used mobile cavalry and feint retreats, denying Antony what he wanted, a decisive battle. Time, after all, was not on Antony's side. He was betrayed by his Armenian ally, Artavasdes II, who withdrew at a critical moment and refused to bring reinforcements. Frustrated, denied, and short on supplies, Antony was forced into a brutal winter retreat, losing more than a quarter of his forces. Plutarch vividly describes his men eating animal hides, drinking putrid water, and dying of frostbite. Cassius Dio echoes the scale of the failure. He barely escaped alive. Another Roman general who enters Parthia and pays the price for it. Again, the difference between Octavian and Antony are very well underlined by this situation. Antony was trying for a masterstroke, for something great, for something, let's say it, Caesarian. He was following Caesar's advice. After all, Caesar wanted to do this himself. But Octavian was playing a completely different game. His successes were quieter. By now, Agrippa had built new harbors, defeated Sextus Pompey, the son of Pompey, who still controlled a vast fleet in the Mediterranean, and he had pacified rebellious regions in Illyria. Octavian was reshaping Italy and Roman institutions. Antony was losing men in the east and becoming further entangled with Cleopatra. And yet, Antony didn't return to Rome. His growing problems were there, but he remained in Alexandria and staged a kind of political revenge, the already discussed donation of Alexandria. Now Antony wasn't blind, and when rage subsided, he decided to try another big swing. Something to gain approval in Rome. And what wins hearts and minds in Rome? Victory. In 34 BC, Antony entered Armenia and arrested the traitor Artavasdes for the glory of Rome. But then the mistakes kept happening. He staged a triumph after this victory, and he did it in Alexandria, not in Rome. This act was a flagrant violation of Roman custom. Triumphs were sacred rites held in the capital. Holding one in a foreign city, in the company of a queen, was effectively an announcement of an alternative Roman order. This was the beginning of war. In 33 BC, the final renewal of the Triumvirate was due, and Antony let it lapse. Octavian reacted immediately. He no longer called himself Triumvir for the organization of the state, but Imperator, a title he had earned through multiple acclamations. Armed now with supreme authority, and with the people being very angry at Antony, especially after the reveal of his will, a will that heavily favored Cleopatra, which might have been exaggerated or selectively quoted, of course, but it doesn't truly matter to the casus belli. Octavian pursued an extraordinary legal path. In late 32 BC, after gathering senatorial support, including many defectors from Antony's camp, he included a motion in the Senate to declare war not on Antony, but on Cleopatra. This legal fiction preserved the appearance of Roman unity. Antony, still a Roman citizen and consul, could not be attacked directly, but his foreign consort could be. And in the process, anyone who fought alongside her could be labeled a traitor. With the corpse of the Republic still lying under them, Antony and Octavian were ready for their final dance. Agrippa had worked for a long time to prepare for this war. With the Mediterranean between them, they knew it would be fought primarily at sea. In 31 BC, Agrippa launched a lightning campaign through the Ionian Sea, seizing key naval positions of modern-day Corfu, Leucas, and Patri. These ports represented Antony's lifeline to Greece and the East. By seizing them, Agrippa ensured that Antony would be forced into a corner. Meanwhile, Maeceas remained in Rome, keeping order with quiet efficiency. As in the previous year, Octavian carefully staged his movements to appear not as power-hungry as one could see him, but as a servant of Rome's gods. Livy emphasizes these preparations. He made vast public oaths and religious preparations. Temples were filled with offering, Italians were offering oaths of loyalty to Octavian himself, not to Rome. Augurs were consulted, omens displayed for the public to interpret, all reinforcing the idea that this was a divinely sanctioned war. Again, we see that three-headed dragon. While Octavian is looking at the bigger picture, Maeceas is protecting his interests in Rome, and Agrippa is handling a lightning attack quicker than anyone could think. Antony, on his side, retained a massive military power. Antony still had a massive army, a massive fleet, the wealth of Egypt, alliances with Eastern kings, and access to seasoned veterans from previous campaigns. Cleopatra, far from being a mere consort, played a strategic role. She founded the fleet, commanded ships, and handled diplomacy. She was Queen, Admiral, and partner. It is Plutarch himself, our gossip girl, who notes that she was present at every war council, made key naval decisions, and led her own flotilla. Her goal was not only survival but dominance, to forge a new Eastern empire that rivaled Rome in wealth, culture, and sovereignty. Now, there were many encounters in this war, but we are going to focus only on the climactic battle. In general, though, we have to explain what happened. So, while Antony's forces were formidable, on paper, the situation deteriorated due to two key factors. First, inflexibility or, well, age. Antony had refused to abandon his large oared fleet, despite being outmaneuvered. Octavian's ships, while often facing superior numbers, were newer, were lighter, faster, better supplied. All of that work that Agrippa had put in, the new harbors, the new fleet, the technological improvements, and the experience gained by fighting Sextus Pompey, all played a role into creating a new generation of Roman naval combat, fighting now against the older methods employed by Antony. The second factor is Cleopatra. Many among the Eastern kings didn't like that Cleopatra played such a large role in the war. They didn't like having a woman among them, they didn't like having a woman above them, and they didn't necessarily like the idea of this Cleopatra-centric Eastern bloc. Many in Antony's camp defected. Cassius Dio claims that Cleopatra's presence caused multiple commanders to question the war legitimacy. Some considered mutiny. Plutarch suggests that Cleopatra and Antony argued repeatedly, with Cleopatra urging a retreat to Egypt and regrouping, while Antony insisted on staking everything on a single naval confrontation. Now, let's stop for a second. Who was right? Who was wrong? Were these people just generally sexist? Of course, a level of sexism of not wanting to be under a woman exists, and it is a strong presence in this story. But let's put it aside for a second in order to be able to see the consequences of our characters' decisions. First of all, was Cleopatra's presence necessary? I would argue that it wasn't. Cleopatra's presence at war was a problem and nothing more. Of course, because of the sexism and because she really wanted to take decisions she discussed with others, and let's admit it, Cleopatra has such a fascinating historical figure that people overhype her abilities a lot. But at war, she had no acolytes. She did really nothing relevant. She had no experience, especially relevant to a conflict so large and so Roman-centric. Her own counsel of retreating to Egypt made no sense strategically. Agrippa's blockade was nearly complete. Octavian had trapped them at Actium. Retreating to Egypt only meant putting more time on the table, meaning more time for people to defect, to betray, to go away. Time meant the necessity of more supplies, more money. So I would argue that it is clear that Antony's choice of staking everything on a battle was the right one. The problem was that he had created a situation where victory was very hard to achieve, and part of it was because of his relationship with Cleopatra. Now, I have talked a little in general. Until now, I've talked about naval blockade. Let's go into specifics. As the war was declared, Cleopatra and Antony reacted by moving into Greece, which was the launching position to harass Italy and potentially attack it. The two placed their headquarters in Patre, on the western coast of Greece. Antony was preparing an ambush. He was creating the illusion he was about to attack Italy, he was preparing to start an invasion, when in actuality he was creating a defensible position in a gulf, where he could attract Agrippa, Octavian, and destroy them. The problem was that Antony wasn't facing Octavian, a young and inexperienced commander, even if a great politician. He was facing Agrippa, an equally young but extremely experienced commander. Agrippa understood immediately that he could just leave Antony alone and hit the supply lines around him. During the first days of March 31 BC, Agrippa attacked the Antony forces in Metone. Supplies now needed to get to Antony by land and not by sea, making everything slower and more dangerous. Suddenly, time switched side. When before Antony was creating this ambush, taking his own time to attract the enemy into an indefensible position, now he was in a very defensible position but without supplies, meaning Agrippa could take his time picking at him. While Agrippa was indirectly besieging Antony, Octavian was unloading his own troops in Epirus and moving into Corfu. Cornered and without many options, Cleopatra and Antony moved their headquarters into Actium. By conquering the island of Leuca, Agrippa completely surrounded the enemy. Octavian didn't need to engage, he could wait, and he could because of the three-headed dragon. He had no rush. He knew Agrippa wouldn't steal glory from him. Even if Agrippa won by himself, he wouldn't steal glory from him, because they were the same person. Two men, one entity, all glory. The engagement would be fought in both land and sea, but it was the naval part that was going to be determining who would win. Especially since Cleopatra wanted that to be the center stage, the focus of their offensive, to break free from envelopment. Of course, we're basing ourselves on sources to say this, so it might be that sources just hate Cleopatra. That's just a possibility. Now, to give an idea of the forces in the field, there were between 50 and 60 legions at the Battle of Actium. 21 for Octavian, 30 for Antony. Octavian could count on around 400 ships and 80,000 soldiers, while Antony had 480 ships and 84,000 soldiers. Now, don't let these numbers fool you. The soldiers of Antony were, not in large part, but in part, men of the Ptolemaic army, a force that could not in any way compare to Roman legions. We have already talked about the difference in technology and military advancement for the ships, so I'm not going to repeat myself. The two fleets facing each other in front of the Gulf remained still for a long time, at least until midday. Then the left flank of Antony engaged. We don't know exactly why. It could be that they were trying to break free and abandon their commander. It could be that it was a tactical choice decided beforehand. In any case, this worked for Agrippa, because Agrippa's plan was simple. allow the enemy to advance, allow the enemy to engage, retreat into open sea where their speed, experience, and maneuverability could give them the upper hand. As the two fleets maneuvered in front of each other and slowly the Antonian fleet started to fall for this trick, a hole opened up in the Agrippa formation. And that was the chance. It was the chance for Cleopatra to intervene and attack. Now, we don't know if this would have made a difference, honestly. Probably no. What we know is this is the dramatic high point of the story, because Cleopatra uses the hole not to fight, but to escape. She leaves Antony behind. Of course, in a moment of high drama such as this one, Plutarch has something to say. He paints it as a personal betrayal. He saw Cleopatra's ship hoisting sail in flight, and forgetting all, he followed. But Cassius Dio and modern scholars suggest it was prearranged, that Antony had planned this escape in advance, hoping to salvage his remaining forces in Egypt. It's difficult to say what the truth is. In actuality, we know about this breach by the same sources that are telling us the interpretation of it. So whether this is a failed retreat with only Cleopatra and a few ships getting out, or a dramatic betrayal with Antony running after his lover who just threw it all away, it is for us to interpret. Maybe you'll let me know what you think in the comments. The traditional story is that Antony went after Cleopatra, and the men, noticing that Antony was gone, tried to salvage the situation. Velleius Paterculus wrote, "The soldiers acted like the best of commanders and the commander like the lowest of soldiers." As Antony's fleet kept moving out in open sea, the distance between them became too large, space that could be used to maneuver by the smaller and more agile ships of Agrippa. As evening came, around 40 ships from Antony's side were sunk, and 5,000 men drowned beneath the waves of Actium. Octavian had lost, well, almost nothing. The psychological impact of Actium was enormous. For Romans, it was not just a naval victory, it was a moral and divine triumph. Octavian's propaganda machine immediately went to work. In Rome, coins were minted bearing the image of Victoria Navalis, the goddess of naval victory. The temple of Janus was closed once again, marking the restoration of peace. Poets hailed the battle as the day Rome was saved from a foreign queen. Virgil, writing just a few years later, enshrined Actium in his Aeneid, describing a prophetic shield depicting the Battle of Actium with Augustus leading Italians into war, Agrippa's gods blazing from his brows, and Antony with barbaric wealth and horde of eastern nations behind him. This image would dominate for generations. Actium was no longer just a victory, it was the clash of civilizations, the defense of tradition, the divine endorsement of Octavian, the basis of Imperium. Cleopatra and Antony fled to Alexandria, but their fate was sealed. Octavian did not pursue immediately, he secured Greece, rewarded allies, and allowed the image of his invincibility to solidify. He had no rush, no opponents. In the end, Agrippa's genius, noticing the weak point in Antony's position and Antony's weakened leadership, maybe from Cleopatra's presence itself, were the determining factors of Actium. Now, ancient sources differ slightly on the sequence of events following Actium, but most agree that Antony and Cleopatra spent the winter of 31-30 attempting to salvage their position. Plutarch and Cassius Dio portray a period of fluctuating moods, at times fatalistic, at others energetic. Cleopatra organized ceremonies, maintained a courtly facade, and even sent emissaries with gifts for Octavian. Maybe she was hoping to ensure a position in the future and preparing to abandon Antony. Now, in reality, she had no leverage, so you have to believe she thought she did. Otherwise, why send all of these gifts? Was it just desperation? It is very possible that Cleopatra thought of herself as Egypt, thought that she was the only one who could hold Egypt whole, who could make it work, and since Egypt was so important to the Roman economy, especially the grain economy, well, there's your leverage. Problem is, it wasn't true. Cleopatra wasn't Egypt. Egypt could be controlled, as it will be proven by Augustus himself. Now, I have been very critical of Cleopatra during all of this video, and I believe I have just because usually she is pointed at as a very smart character, so a little bit of critique was necessary because of the zeitgeist. But before you go away thinking I hate Cleopatra, which is not true, I really love the historical character, you have to understand that her mistakes could have been her genius moments. After all great historical characters start from assumptions. The problem of Cleopatra was that her assumptions didn't pan out. But it's not like her assumptions were based on worse information than assumptions made by many people in history who won. It is all about understanding the context, and well, sometimes something just slips away from you. Can't we all relate to that? One by one, Antony's allies defected. He was left alone with Cleopatra in Alexandria. His forces were decimated by desertion. By the summer of 30 BC, Octavian began his final march on Egypt. He was unopposed and besieged Alexandria by July. Despite desperate measures, Antony had no way to get out of this. On August 1st, hearing incorrectly that Cleopatra had taken her own life, he fell on his sword, a gesture laden with Roman symbolism, echoing Brutus and Cato. Still alive, he was brought bleeding to Cleopatra's mausoleum, where she had barricaded herself with her handmaidens and her treasures. Of course, Plutarch is the one to tell us this story. His account is deeply theatrical. Antony, dying in Cleopatra's arms, begs her to save herself. He laments his failure and exhales his last breath while lifted into the tower via ropes. It reads like a high tragedy, but also as political messaging. Antony died as a Roman, by suicide rather than by enemies' hands. It was a final attempt at reclaiming honor, a very Plutarch way to end a story. Cleopatra survived for 11 more days. Octavian had her captured and, according to Suetonius and Cassius Dio, kept her under guard, attempting to parade her in his triumph. He wanted to bring her to Rome alive. But she, knowing the fate of defeated monarchs in Rome celebrations, meaning she was probably gonna be stripped, shackled and humiliated, refused. For one last time she attempted to persuade Octavian, offering treasure, her children, even personal charm. But Octavian was unmoved. Ice cold. Now let's throw away those pesky, boring political things and listen to Plutarch. Plutarch records that Cleopatra tried to gauge Octavian's intentions by seducing him, but his resolve remained cold and political. Eventually, realizing that she would be taken to Rome, she took her own life. And isn't that a very Plutarch way to end another story? In the end, the seduction Cleopatra had used on Caesar, on Antony, failed on Octavian. The weapon that had made her was the weapon that failed her before she died. The means of her death became legendary. Plutarch, probably not knowing exactly which to choose, offers three versions: a poisoned comb or ointment, a hidden asp smuggled in a fig basket, a bite from a snake or poisonous pins sewn into her hair or clothing. Cassius Dio reports that she had tested multiple poisons on prisoners to determine the least painful method. Modern historians remain skeptical about the asp story. It seems too poetic, too staged, and perhaps encouraged by Octavian to create a noble death that preserved her dignity while eliminating her threat. Regardless of method, Cleopatra died at age 39. ending the Ptolemaic dynasty that had ruled Egypt since Alexander's general Ptolemy seized it centuries earlier. But what about Caesarion, the son of Caesar? Well, Cassius Dio reports as a primary source that says it is not good to have too many Caesars. Caesarion disappears from the pages of history, killed in the shadows by Octavian's agents. Of the various children of Cleopatra and Antony, only one remains into the pages of history. Cleopatra Selene. She would be married to King Juba II of Mauritania, forming a dynastic union that kept the Ptolemaic blood alive in Roman Africa. Now Octavian had the huge wealth of Egypt at his fingertips. He could sack the entire kingdom, become immensely rich. But he was remarkably measured. The temples remained intact, and Octavian even proclaimed himself pharaoh in Egyptian style. He did it by still avoiding carefully deification within Roman customs, but he did it. He kept Egypt under his personal control, governed by a praefectus Egypti, rather than a senatorial proconsul. He recognized the wealth and strategic value of Egypt was absolute. This is why Cleopatra had no chance to negotiate. Octavian had already made calculation and knew that controlling Egypt personally 100% was the key of maintaining power as an emperor. Octavian remained in the east for nearly a year after Antony and Cleopatra died. He consolidated control and secured Egypt completely. When he returned to Italy in the summer of 29 BC, he did it not as a general seeking office, but as a conqueror bringing peace. And every moment of that return was carefully orchestrated. Suetonius and Cassius Dio describe his triumphal entry in Rome as a masterclass in symbolic politics. Octavian was granted a triple triumph, the rarest of honors, celebrating 3 campaigns: Illyricum, Actium, and Alexandria. The whole of 29 BC became a celebration of Augustus, the 3-headed dragon, and all heads of the dragon acted. Octavian closed the Temple of Janus, as we said, representing the beginning of peace. Agrippa staged games, sponsored public works, and repaired infrastructure. Maeceas at the same time curated the message. He founded poets, commissioned dedications, and elevated the cultural narrative that Rome had passed through chaos and emerged reborn. And with Octavia, our princess, slowly fading into the background, Livia Drusilla, the empress, took complete center stage, the new living emblem of Roman virtues. It would take 2 years for Octavian to truly turn into Augustus. And that is where we're gonna stop our story. In the next episode, we will talk about his reign, completing our trilogy on the rise of the empire. But before we go, I wanna say what Augustus did, what Octavian did, to solidify and underline his rise to power. Why 27 BC is so important. He renounced his extraordinary powers, returning them to the Senate and the Roman people, and was then begged by the Senate to retain control. This is how deep Octavian victory went. His way to announce his rise to absolute power was to renounce that same power and be begged by those who would take back that power to retain it. A new era was rising. Octavian might be the first emperor, but he wasn't really an emperor, he was the princeps. He was the first among equal. He was at the head of a republican structure with a dead republic under him. He was playing weekends at Bernie's with the republic. Next time we will see what he did, how he structured this new empire, how he governed it, how Agrippa influenced it deeply, and how, in the end, succession became the name of the game. In 31 BC, at the Battle of Actium, the fate of Rome was decided. Octavian, soon to be called Augustus, faced the combined forces of Mark Antony and Cleopatra. It was a battle cloaked in scandal. Antony, once Caesar's right-hand man, had aligned himself with the Egyptian queen, alienating Roman sensibilities and inciting Octavian's carefully crafted propaganda machine. It was a total victory. Within a year, both Antony and Cleopatra were dead, either by suicide or, some whispered, by the quiet engineering of Octavian's operatives. Egypt was turned into a Roman province, not a senatorial one, but a private possession of Octavian himself. As Tacitus would later write in his Annals, all the power of the state had been transferred to one man. This is usually the end of the story. Octavian wins, becomes Augustus, and reigns supreme in Rome. But of course, the game of Rome was not over. The rules had changed, the players were new ones, but Augustus' Rome is a beast that needs to be studied if one wants to understand why Europe remained so attached to the Roman Empire. Because if one looks at the history of Europe as a grand narrative, this is the true beginning. Everything that happened before was the introduction. So let's get into it. Octavian faced a paradox. He had crushed all rivals and held total command of the army, the treasury, and public opinion even. Yet, the Roman people still bore a centuries-old hatred for kingship. The very idea of a monarch had been poisonous ever since the expulsion of Tarquin the Proud in 509 BC. Julius Caesar's assassination was justified as a necessary act to preserve the Republic from tyranny. The dagger still cast a long shadow against anyone who wanted to wear a crown. And so, Octavian needed a solution to this puzzle. Luckily, he had one. His genius was not in conquering Rome, but in convincing Rome that he had not. He returned to the city in a victory procession, not as a dictator, but as a savior of order and tradition. The Senate and people of Rome lavished honors upon him. But crucially, he framed every move as a reluctant acceptance of duty. He declared himself the restorer of the Republic. I transferred the Republic from my power to the control of the Senate and the Roman people, he would later claim in the Res Gestae, his kind of autobiography. This was of course a lie, and it wasn't. In 27 BC, he officially handed back extraordinary powers to the Senate in a symbolic gesture. The Senate, in turn, granted him a new title, Augustus. This was not merely a name, but a concept. It evoked sacredness, a divine aura, the approval of the gods. As Cassius Dio recounts, the name Augustus was chosen so that he might be revered more than feared. The same year, he was granted imperium over most strategically vital provinces, meaning those with legions. He also, as we said, secured the control of Egypt, a province whose wealth alone gave him leverage over the Senate. In theory, power was being shared. In practice, it had been concentrated, invisibly and irrevocably. The outer forms of the Republic remained. Consuls were being elected, senators were rising, magistrates were doing their job, but most elections were predetermined. As he was bestowed more and more roles, Augustus would often accept reluctantly, and even waited to be begged by the Senate or the people. It was political theater, but the audience was eager to believe. In the Aeneid by Virgil, written during this time and supported by Augustus' inner circle, this kind of mythos is central. The ghost of Achilles tells Aeneas in the book, "Your task, Roman, and do not forget it, is to rule the nations with your power, to impose the habit of peace, to spare the conquered and subdue the proud." The message was very clear. Rome's empire, and Augustus' control, was the will of fate. In Tacitus' words, they gave the title of princeps to Augustus, and by that name all power was veiled. But what was the princeps? It wasn't a king, nor a dictator, just first citizen. The title was carefully chosen, princeps senatus, an old republican title dating back to the 3rd century BC. The title had always referred to the most senior member of the Senate. It carried no formal executive power, but under Augustus it became a cloak for autocracy. He positioned himself as first among equals, a concept that would carry on into medieval Europe. But in truth, no one was equal to Augustus. He held auctoritas above all others. The intangible weight of moral superiority and command was not codified like imperium, but it shaped every decision. Augustus' military control was veiled behind legal fig leaves. He held proconsular imperium maius, or greater proconsular power, meaning his command superseded all other governors. No one could outvote him. This kind of power was legally only applicable to the provinces, but later it extended to Rome itself, ensuring Augustus could intervene anywhere. In 23 BC came what is today known as the Second Settlement, with the first one being the relinquishing of power that we have already talked about. The Second Settlement came after a brief health scare that nearly killed Augustus. This moment terrified Rome. The fear of instability and the potential power vacuum pushed the Senate to grant him tribunitia potestas, the power of a tribune of the plebs. This meant that Octavian, or Augustus, could propose laws, veto decisions, and more importantly, act as the protector of the Roman people. It also tied him to the memory of the Gracchi, tribunes who had championed the poor. His image blended nobility with populism. Again and again, he was offered dictatorship over Rome. He refused. He was offered to be permanent consul. He refused. Leaving the consul chair open for elections was a genius idea because it gave the Senate a space in which they could fight for supremacy between each other without truly confronting Augustus. One could still become consul, the highest possible achievement in Rome, and then quietly allow Augustus to keep ruling. Cassius Dio notes that after these reforms, he did not take any office inconsistent with the laws or the customs of the ancestors, but he managed everything in accordance with them. Dio here is being ironic. Augustus appeared to obey tradition, but in reality he hollowed it out. This strategy continued in his public imagery. He dressed in modest toga rather than royal robes. He walked through the streets unguarded. He called the Senate to session, listened to debates, and made sure that his decrees were proposed by others. In the Res Geste, Augustus claims, "I excelled all in influence, auctoritas, but I had no more power, potestas, than others who were my colleagues." Pure illusion, but an illusion that worked. Now, Octavian might have held the reins of Rome, but no man, not even a princeps, could rule an empire alone. The story of Octavian is a story told in groups of 3. The Second Triumvirate, the first organization that wasn't part of the Roman system to actually control Rome legally, was of course composed by 3 people, Antony, Lepidus, and Octavian. And while the men were controlling and fighting, 3 women were acting right alongside them. Octavia, sister of Octavian, Livia, wife of Octavian, and Cleopatra. So finally, we get to the final and third group of 3. Destiny is weird that way. 3 groups of 3. Because in our little metaphor, Octavian isn't Augustus. Augustus is an entity of his own, formed by 3 people. We've already talked this a lot during the previous episodes. The Roman dragon has 3 heads, and during Octavian's reign, the 3 heads took center stage. We will skip over Octavian since, well, we know him pretty well, and move on to Marcus Agrippa. He was Octavian's oldest and most loyal ally, and after the Battle of Actium, which he personally won since he was the sword of Augustus, he didn't stop his work to improve the Roman Empire. While he was an innovator in naval warfare, introducing new technological systems and strategies, such as the use of the harpax, a grappling device, he was also one of Rome's greatest urban developer. During Augustus' rise, Rome was still a city of unpaved roads, tenements, and fire traps. Agrippa, as aedile in 33 BC, undertook massive infrastructure campaigns. He repaired aqueducts, built new cisterns, cleaned the sewers, and commissioned hundreds of public fountains. Lavish public baths were added to the city landscape, and the original Pantheon, the structure that stood there before the one we know today. In the Res Geste, Augustus boasts, "I built the Forum of Augustus, the temple of Mars Ultor." But many of these projects were in truth Agrippa's work, or founded from his own fortune. Agrippa functioned as Augustus' executor. He implemented the vision, kept the peace, and made it appear as if the city itself was rising up from the ground to embrace the princeps in love. Politically, Agrippa played a delicate role. Though he had the respect of the army and the people, he never posed a threat, and that was an art. Augustus trusted him to hold temporary consulship, command provinces, and even act as second in command when Augustus fell ill. In 23 BC, when Augustus nearly died, there were rumors that he handed his signet ring to Agrippa rather than any senator or blood relative. Agrippa's marriage to Julia, Augustus' daughter, cemented his role in the imperial family. They had several children, Gaius, Lucius, and Agrippina the Elder, who would be drawn into the blood-soaked web of imperial succession. Agrippa became more than a friend. He became a founding patriarch of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. He died in 12 BC at the age of 51, likely from illness. He was the arm and the sword of Augustus, capable of holding immense power without ever becoming a threat. Perfect balance, as no other triumvirate ever could. But if Agrippa was Augustus' right hand, then Maecenas was his heart, his lips, and his tongue. Differently from Agrippa, he held no formal power, but his influence was immense. He never sought office. Instead, he operated in the quiet corridors of the Domus, managing foreign diplomacy, domestic policy, and above all, propaganda. Tacitus later alludes to Maecenas as one of the architects of the Principate ideological structure. Maecenas understood the power of narrative. He surrounded himself with poets, artists, and thinkers who could recast Augustus not as a victor in a civil war, but the savior of Rome. Through him, Augustus became not a tyrant but a second Romulus. He patronized Virgil, whose Aeneid created a new mythical origin for Rome, completely linked to Augustus. In Book 1, after all, Jupiter prophesies that from this noble line shall be born a Trojan Caesar who will extend his empire to the ocean and his glory to the stars. Horace, another of Maecenas' circle, was more subtle. His odes blend personal reflection with civic duty. In his work, he laments moral decline and urges a return to traditional Roman value, exactly the message Augustus needed the population to embrace. Even Propertius, whose poetry was erotic and personal, found ways to embed imperial imagery in his writing. "Let Caesar be a god, and let him have his temple among us." Maecenas shaped public perception more effectively than any law. Through him, Augustus became not just a man, but a myth. He retired from public life in 16 BC, possibly due to declining health or more personal reasons, a disillusionment, if you will. So, if Augustus has 3 heads, who stands beside him? That would be Livia Drusilla, married to Augustus in 38 BC. Now, we have already talked about the weird situations with children in the last episode, so I will summarize. She gave Augustus no sons, but maneuvered carefully to ensure her own son future, since she had a previous husband and a previous child, Tiberius. She understood better than anyone that the real game at the time was succession. No one could really stand up to Augustus so the road to power was to be prepared for the moment he would be no more. Now, everything we know about Livia is very complex on a historiographical level. After all, spoiler alert, she won the succession game. And since the resulting reign wasn't necessarily popular, her figure in history has paid the price for it. She is often depicted as a spider, a poisoner, a killer, slaughtering Augustus' family one by one in order to get Tiberius on the throne. We'll talk about that in a second, but what we can say is that even if Livia wasn't the spider she was depicted as, she most certainly was a capable woman who kept a dense network of spies and alliances, deeply respected, extremely feared, and especially the model of a Roman woman. Chaste, dignified, loyal. It's weird how history can create two faces, right? The perfect woman and the spider. And yet, of course, it doesn't take a genius to understand that one can spin the web in whatever direction he chooses. She can be the perfect woman, or she can act as the perfect woman. So a spider, or not a spider. Now, as far as succession goes, Augustus' first experiment with dynastic succession came early. His sister Octavia's son, Marcellus, was young, promising, and beloved by the public. He was given early honors, allowed to hold office years before the legal age, and in 25 BC, Augustus married him to his daughter Julia, a transparent move to position him as heir. But naturally, Marcellus was young, untested, and may have lacked the political cunning needed to survive in the shadows of Augustus' older advisors. He died suddenly in 23 BC at just 19. The cause was officially illness, but ancient sources like Cassius Dio and Tacitus hint at tensions in the court. Livia, the spider, was whispered to have resented him, but there is no way to know what happened. Virgil, writing soon after, inserted a famous and deeply emotional passage into the Aeneid where Aeneas sees the spirit of Marcellus in the underworld. Anchises weeps, saying, "O child of pity, if only you could break your cruel fate," a public display of grief for the lost heir. With Marcellus gone, Augustus turned again to Agrippa, his old comrade. He gave him tribunician power, made him his military proxy, and crucially married him to Julia, as we said, after Marcellus' death. This second marriage was entirely political. From this union came Gaius, born in 20 BC, and Lucius, born in 17 BC. Both of these children were adopted by Augustus as his own sons in 17 BC. Coins were minted in their name. Statues were erected. The public was trained to recognize their faces. They were declared princeps juventutis, leaders of the youth, and given command appointments while still teenagers. Of course, we're talking ceremonial appointments. The boys were symbols, puppets moved around a chessboard of image and tradition. In reality, the empire was still Augustus to run. When Agrippa died in 12 BC, Augustus became sole ruler once more. Yet, the line of succession, now clear on paper, was anything but secured. Julia, mother of the imperial heirs, and Augustus' only child, became a liability. Despite being used as a dynastic pawn, she rebelled against the strict morality Augustus imposed on Rome. Her infidelities became public, then scandalous. In 2 BC, she was arrested and exiled for adultery and immorality. Tacitus frames this as political. Julia had formed her own faction. Removing her wasn't about virtue, it was about control. Two women, two factions, fighting for succession, were suddenly watching House of the Dragon. Augustus was devastated. The woman he had used to build his dynasty had humiliated him, and he now raised Gaius and Lucius alone. But fate struck again. Lucius died in 2 AD, on his way to the Spanish frontier. Gaius, wounded in Armenia, died in 4 AD of lingering injuries. Another two heirs, groomed for 2 decades, dead within 2 years. And this time, one would have to go deep into conspiracy to put these kills on Livia's head. With them gone, only one man remained. Only one who was young enough to guarantee stability, and experienced enough not to, well, destroy the empire. Tiberius Claudius Nero, Livia's son by her first marriage. After all, Tiberius had served loyally, fought on the Rhine, in Pannonia and in Armenia, earning a reputation as a capable, if sullen, commander. He was no Agrippa, no genius of the battlefield, no charismatic heir. He was quiet, methodical, and painfully reluctant. Augustus never seemed to favor him. In fact, he had once forced Tiberius to divorce his beloved wife, Vipsania Agrippina, Agrippa's daughter, to marry the disgraced and widowed Julia. The marriage was a disaster. Tiberius resented it deeply and eventually exiled himself to Rhodes, claiming illness but likely retreating in despair. And yet, in 4 AD, Augustus had no more choices. He adopted Tiberius as his son, formally bringing him into the Julian line. At the same time, though, he adopted Agrippa Postumus, the third son of Julia and Agrippa, a brutish, violent youth with little political promise. A backup in case Tiberius failed, but not a realistic one. Now, considering the case that Livia didn't kill anyone to get Tiberius on the throne, you have to understand that it is realistic that people thought so. Tacitus, after all, describes Tiberius as dark and insincere. Suetonius calls him morose, secretive, and cruel. Whether these accounts are exaggerated by later scandals is uncertain, but even in his lifetime, he was seen as a poor replacement. As for Agrippa Postumus, he didn't last long. He was banished in 7 AD under murky charges. We still have some stuff to talk about before the succession, though. How did the republican institutions that the empire was wearing, like a skin mask, work? Formally, the Senate was retaining its authority. It deliberated, passed decrees, offered guidance to magistrates. But Augustus had already neutered it during the second settlement of 23 BC, when he assumed Imperium Maius Proconsulare, a power that outranked every governor in the empire. By that time, the Senate had lost its most important power, control over the provinces. Augustus took the provinces that had armies, as we said, Hispania, Gaul, Syria, Egypt, while leaving the most peaceful and impoverished ones, like Achaia and Macedonia, to senatorial control. Membership in the Senate was also curated. Augustus purged it twice, once in 28 BC and again in 18 BC, reducing it from over 900 people to a more manageable 600. The Senate became a club of loyalists, made up of men whose wealth, titles, or survival often depended on the favor of the princeps. Suetonius tells us that during his reign, Augustus never openly overrode the Senate. Instead, he advised, and his recommendations were always adopted. After 23 BC, Augustus held no official role in the Roman government. Yet, he ruled with more authority than any consul before him. As princeps, he was simply the first to speak, the first to be obeyed, the man whose absence stalled legislation and whose approval was the air everyone breathed. But if the institutions in Rome still looked republican, the army no longer did. Under the Republic, Rome's military had been a citizen army, conscripts raised in times of war, then discharged. After the Marian reforms, in the late 2nd century BC, the legions had begun to professionalize, but it was Augustus who finalized this transformation. He created a standing army, fixed in number, 28 legions, later fluctuating a little bit, stationed throughout the provinces. Service became a 20-year career, with fixed pay, equipment, and specific retirement benefits, not like the times where Pompey had to fight to get his men land. In order to do this, Augustus created the Aerarium Militare in 6 AD, a military treasury founded by new taxes, including a 5% inheritance tax and a 1% sales tax. This fund ensured veterans received land grants or cash payments upon retirement. Not from the general as it was before, but from the state itself. So Augustus had the elite and he had the army, but it wasn't enough. The people remained. The Roman populace, long accustomed to civil war, famine and instability, needed reassurance. So he gave them what they wanted: peace, food, and spectacle. The grain dole, annona, was systematized. Though this was started during the Republic, Augustus expanded its distribution and tied the food supply deeply to imperial benevolence. Hundreds of thousands of Romans received monthly grain rations. Other than this and the architectural work of Agrippa himself, he also provided games. Gladiatorial contests, chariot races, and theatrical performance became imperial gifts. Augustus often presided in person, something many other emperors will do after him, practically all of them, because, after all, this kind of fun, this kind of prosperity, only comes from the emperor. And as a father, he needs to sit at the head of the table. And here we enter one of Augustus' most ambitious programs, the moral reformation of Roman society. To do so, he passed a series of laws: the Lex Iulia de Maritandi Ordinibus, the Lex Papia Poppaea, all created to regulate marriage, adultery, and procreation. These laws rewarded Roman citizens for marrying and having children, especially among the upper classes. Penalties were imposed on those unmarried or childless. Adultery, previously a private matter, became a public crime, punishable by exile and confiscation of property. Now, these laws were not really in the Roman ethos. The Romans did value virtue, but privately they were far more liberal. Even Augustus' own daughter, Julia, was persecuted under these laws. Exiled for adultery in 2 BC, some saw this as hypocrisy, others saw this as proof that the laws applied even to the imperial family. The goal was twofold: to promote a return to traditional Roman values, and to reinforce Augustus as moral compass of the state. He was not just a ruler, he was the architect of virtue. But enforcement was inconsistent. The elite resented interference in their private affairs. Marriages became strategic and performative. Children were raised for census numbers. This was the part of Augustus' project that never really worked. But even with this failure under his belt, Augustus had changed Rome deeply. He lived long enough to see the world he'd remade fully stabilized in his image. By the year 14 AD, he was 75 years old. His health was in decline, his trusted circle had grown smaller, and Rome had grown quiet, almost unnaturally so. For the first time in memory, there was no civil war at the horizon, no revolutions waiting to happen, no upheaval. The man who had once been a teenage claimant in a broken world was now the living embodiment of Roman permanence. His deification was completely assured. Already people were worshipping him, and while he didn't want to be worshipped, he wanted it for later because, well, that would give his dynasty exactly what Caesar gave him: to be the inheritors of the legacy of a god. In his final years, Augustus increasingly withdrew from public life. He spent much of his time in the Campania region, near Naples, especially at his villa in Nola, not far from where his father had died decades earlier. Suetonius records that Augustus remained lucid to the end. He concerned himself with logistics, had time with his close family, and even joked about his death. His last words to the gathered friends and attendants, according to the more theatrical tradition, were, "Have I played my part well in the comedy of life? Then applaud as I exit." Yet Suetonius also records a simpler, more intimate version. Words spoken to Livia as he died in her arms. "Livia, live mindful of our union. Farewell." And so came the time of Tiberius. He was hesitant, according to Tacitus, even restrained. He shed tears, groaned, called himself unworthy, and yet he failed to reject the empire. The Senate, knowing the performance was a ritual, played their part, urging him to accept. They pretended to doubt whether he truly wanted a dance, a tradition of forced reluctance that Augustus had started. But Tiberius was most probably actually reluctant. He had been trained to rule but never learned to inspire. The early years of his reign were marked by uncertainty. Was he truly the emperor? Was the Republic still alive? Was Livia, his mother, the actual emperor? With the death of Augustus, the imperial cult became large, extremely important, so powerful that Tiberius himself had to stop it from being a little too forward in worshipping him immediately. After all, in 15 AD, the Senate proposed building a temple to Tiberius and Livia. He declined. Cassius Dio says Tiberius claimed that only gods dead and deified officially should receive temples. In the end, Augustus won the greatest political gamble in Roman history, using contradictions, using illusions. He created a monarchy while claiming to preserve a republic. He killed his way to power, then ruled with absolute restraint. He died as a mortal and rose as a god. But his greatest achievement was that after death, he made people forget the difference. He killed the contradiction. Rome had no constitutional mechanism for monarchy, no divine right. It had only the inertia of memory. And Augustus gave that memory form, weight, ritual, and permanence. The empire would fracture, reform, and eventually, in the end, fall. But in every generation of emperors, from Trajan to Diocletian, from Constantine to Justinian, there would be one unshakable question in the heart of each of them. How do you measure up to Augustus?